So, hello everyone. Thanks for inviting me here. And so, like I just said, my name is Camille Taylor. I'm from LAF, the Legal Assistance Foundation, as is Dahlia. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about juvenile expungement. So that's any arrest occurring before the age of 18. And then I'm also, at the end of my presentation, I'll be talking a little bit about adult expungement, which is any arrest occurring before or after the age of 18. So I'll kind of get into the specifics of that. But I'll just talk about why it's important and how it can be done. So just first of all, a little bit of background as to why juvenile expungement is important and significant right now. First of all, like 80 to 90% of juveniles have admitted in private interviews that they've done something illegal that, under the law, whether it be a small crime or a major crime, but something, just because juveniles are prone to get into mischief. And so basically the premise of this program is that a juvenile should not be punished for the rest of their lives for doing something that they did when they were a teenager. So the other thing to keep in mind is that this is kind of a racial issue as well. So statistics show that African Americans are more likely to be arrested for the exact same crime than their white counterparts, as are Latino and Hispanic people. So just depending on the neighborhood that someone lives in, or where they're located, they could be targeted by the police basically for doing the same thing that another person is doing. And then the Juvenile Court Act kind of provides that juvenile records will be sealed, but there's no real definition of what that means. So even though these records are supposed to be sealed and they're supposed to be confidential, they're not usually, they're usually accessible to someone who's looking for them. And so that's the other thing. There's a lot of misunderstanding when I talk to people about juvenile expungement. People think that their records are already confidential, they're already secret, but really you have to take steps to get rid of those records or else they will continue to exist. So that's why expungement is so important. And then we have so many arrests in Cook County. Last year I think we had close to 6,000 and we only had 600 expungements. So there's still all those people walking around with juvenile records because they got arrested. And those arrest records are never going to go away. Those will continue to exist and continue to come up on background checks for people who don't take the affirmative steps to get those records expunged. And the good news is that once a person petitions for expungement, it's very easy to get that expungement. There's a certain statutory requirements, but as long as those are met, the judge cannot deny the expungement. And so that's the good news. Even though it can come back up on a background check and it can affect a person's future, it's very easy to wipe it off and get it taken care of. So. Okay, so today we're just going to quickly talk about what is a juvenile record, why might it affect you, how do you know if you're eligible for expungement, and then what is the process to take to get your record expunged. So we have a help desk, and I'll talk about that at the end, but it's, like I said, it's very easy to get your record expunged. So what is a juvenile record? A juvenile arrest is different from an adult arrest, just depending on the age of the arrest. So any arrest, right now the current law, which changed in January of 2014, is that a juvenile arrest is any arrest occurring under the age of 18. So if a person is arrested at 17 or younger, they are a juvenile. If they're arrested 18 or older, they have an adult record. The other thing to keep in mind is that sometimes a juvenile is arrested and tried as an adult. So even though they're 16 years old or some juvenile age, depending on the crime that they're charged with, they may be transferred automatically to adult court and tried as an adult. And in that case, different rules apply, both for the sentencing and then for expungement. So the other thing is that traffic violations are not juvenile records. So for people who get arrested for something like a DUI or get a ticket for speeding, that's not something we can expunge under this process. And then, so for people who are confused, I sometimes just tell them, look at where your case was tried. If you went in front of a judge at 1100 South Hamilton, that's the juvenile courthouse building, so that would be a juvenile record. For people who went to one of the other branch courts, or 26 in California, the main county courthouse, that would be an adult record. So that's another way to tell. But usually just the age distinction is enough for people. And then the other thing to keep in mind is that the law recently changed. So before 2013, 17 was an adult age. So a lot of people have adult records who were arrested So the law doesn't retroactively go back and make you an adult if you were arrested at the age of 17 20 years ago. If you were arrested at the age of 17 20 years ago, that was an adult record, or even 5 years ago. So that's just the last thing to keep in mind. And so when someone gets arrested by the police, there's kind of 3 or 4 places where a record might be kept. And when we expunge that record, we're basically alerting all these different agencies to expunge the records, so that there's really no trace of the record remaining in any of these different places where it's kept. So the first people who would make a record and keep it on file would be the arresting agency. Usually when we're in Chicago, we're dealing with Chicago police. So most of my clients that I interact with have been arrested by the Chicago police. So their protocol is that they fingerprint the person that they're arresting, and that's how they make the record. So sometimes when I talk to clients, they think, oh, well, the Chicago police don't actually have a record of me because I gave them a fake name or I gave them a fake birth date. But see, they took the fingerprint, and so that's a very accurate way. And so the Chicago police will have the accurate information, and any aliases that someone has given them will also come up when that fingerprint comes up. But no matter what, for a person who's arrested, all those arrests will be stored under that same fingerprint. So it's a very accurate way of keeping that information stored. Second, usually Chicago police might forward that information to the Illinois State Police. So depending on the class of the arrest, if it was a misdemeanor, Chicago police might not forward it. They can if they want to. If it's a felony, Chicago police will definitely forward to the Illinois State Police. And so that's the difference there. FBI used to get a copy as well. So sometimes that will be housed in the FBI as well. So now you've got Chicago, Illinois, and then the FBI. And the last place is the Cook County Clerk of Court. So they might have a record for anyone who actually had a court date. So for someone who went in front of a judge and had a case at a courtroom, they would have something in the clerk system. So all those different places are expunging when we fill out the paperwork and the petition to expunge a record. All those people get a notice that the record is being expunged when the judge signs the order. And so now I'm just going to talk a little bit about why a juvenile record might affect someone. So like I said, there's a lot of misconceptions and misunderstandings out there. People think, well, like I had a juvenile record, but that occurred a long time ago, so no one really knows about it, and it's not going to affect my future. And while the Illinois law does understand that juveniles think differently and act differently than adults, and the juvenile law is a lot more lenient than adult law for expungement, it's still important to get this expunged because, like I said, it's not going to automatically disappear when someone turns 18. It's got to be, you've got to take affirmative steps to get it expunged. So the first place that this might become an issue is when applying for schools. So a lot of these are just future opportunities that could be limited by having a juvenile record. So when you're applying for colleges or scholarships, a juvenile background can come up if someone's doing a background check on you. And that's a good reason right there to get it expunged when you're trying to pursue a higher education. And then for a lot of jobs, so anyone like trying to work within CPS, even as a crossing guard or school bus driver, they're going to do a very thorough background check that includes both adult and juvenile records and fingerprint all 10 fingers and the whole 9 yards. So that's one of those kind of jobs where it's important to just get this expunged. Another job field where this can come up is in healthcare. So anyone who wants to work in nursing or basically any vulnerable population working with, in a daycare or working with young children, working with sick people in hospitals, working with elderly patients in a nursing home, any of those situations, they involve a pretty thorough background check that will involve most likely an adult and juvenile background check. Private security guards, so this one comes up a lot. Anyone who wants to carry a weapon for their employment will most likely have to undergo a juvenile background check. And I actually had a client at the Juvenile Expungement Help Desk who had been arrested as a juvenile, but this was back in 1960 or 1970, so a very long time ago. He's currently 70 years old and he's retired. He's living in Arizona, but his juvenile background came up when he applied for a private security job to earn a little extra income because, like I said, he's retired. And so this is something that can come up years and years down the line, which just kind of goes to show you that your juvenile record never gets expunged and never goes away unless you take those steps to get it removed. So private security, anyone who's trying to get their FOID card to carry a firearm, any other professional licenses, so a lot of those kind of jobs that require taking a certification test and going through a licensing program, those would all do a background check. So a lot of my clients have been going through nursing school, and a lot of them have actually moved to other states, and they have to come back to Chicago to attend their court date and take care of this business. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is that those are the jobs mostly that can legally look into this, but some employers will unlawfully dig into a juvenile background. So it's not quite clear how they get access to this information because it's supposed to be confidential and it's supposed to be sealed. But private employers like Target or restaurants, Home Depot, places like that really don't have any legal reason to look into a juvenile record. Nevertheless, they have often gone and done some digging and found it. And so I've had clients come in and they were working at, I had a client who was working at a restaurant, and she was about 19 years old, and she's been doing a good job at her restaurant job as a waitress. And one day she was approached by the manager and said that she would lose her job because they had done a background check on her unless she got her record expunged. So that wasn't really lawful, but nevertheless, she was very eager to get her record expunged so that she could hold on to that job. So what is expungement exactly? Expungement is just a fancy word for erasing your juvenile record. So the only real requirement there, for the most part, is that a person has to be 18 years old to expunge. So even though this is a juvenile record, you have to be an adult to actually get rid of it. And sometimes the age requirement is a little higher, and I'll explain kind of more some detail about that in a second. But basically, we're taking that record and we're erasing it. So it's kind of disappearing from the face of the earth as far as most employers and colleges, all those people I mentioned in the last slide, is basically disappearing as far as they're concerned. So once you get your record expunged and you're applying for jobs or you're applying for colleges, no one can really go back and look at that record and see it. Now, there's only 3 exceptions for that, and I'll kind of briefly go through each of them and what it means. So the first one is military, okay? So for people who have had their record expunged, but then they're applying to be in the military, military officials can still see that record for people who are applying to be in their program, and then they can make a judgment call regarding the offense and how serious it was. They might still accept that person into their program, but it's something that they can see even if it has been expunged. So it still exists in a very limited database that military officials can see. The next is for law enforcement. So there's a big distinction here between law enforcement looking at just a person's record versus law enforcement looking at the record of someone who's applying to be in their program. So if someone expunges their record and then a few years later they get pulled over by the police or they get questioned by the police cannot see that record because it has been expunged. So I had a client recently who had 18 different arrests on his record. We expunged all of them. So after that expungement process has gone through and he gets questioned by the police and the police look him up in their database, they won't see any of those arrests because they're all gone. As far as the police can tell, there's 0 arrests. The only time this would come up for law enforcement is for someone who wants to be a law enforcement official and they're applying for employment with that agency. At that point, someone who's applying to work with the Chicago Police Department can see that juvenile record, even if it's been expunged. That's the only time law enforcement can go back and see that. And then finally, for immigration, so for people who are not U.S. citizens, but they're planning in the future to go through citizenship proceedings, immigration officials can actually see a record that's been expunged. Now, I always tell people it might be better to just wait and not expunge if they're planning on going through immigration proceedings in the future. And the reason for that is because immigration officials can see that there's something on your record, but they can't see what it is, which makes them obviously nervous. It might have been just a simple retail theft, and it might have been something very violent or, more serious. And so they would rather just see it. So I've actually had clients who expunged 3 or 4 years ago, and they come back to the help desk and they said that they wanted to unexpunge because they were going through immigration proceedings. So my advice to people who are planning on possibly immigrating or trying to get citizenship status is wait on expungement and try and get some counsel from an immigration attorney and see what they say. And then maybe expungement is a good option or maybe it's not. But I would advise people to wait if that's an option that they're considering. How expungement works and kind of a little more of the detail of how it works. This is just so that people can get an idea of whether or not they're eligible, because there are certain waiting periods that are in place. So for someone who's just turned 18, they might think that they're eligible because usually a person who's an adult is eligible for expungement. But there are other factors to consider depending on the case type. So for subsection 1, that's kind of the easier type of expungement. And then subsection 2 is the little more difficult because there's a longer waiting period. So subsection 2 is basically anyone who's 18 and doesn't have an open case, they can expunge immediately under subsection 1. And in the next few slides, I'll explain the difference between subsection 1 and subsection 2. But anyone who's 18 and they don't have an open case, so an open case would be they're currently on parole or probation, they're in detention, they're still checking in with their, they still got supervision or something like that. That's an open case. If their case is already wrapped up and they're 18, they should be fine. So subsection 1 would include any non-conviction, or for juveniles it's called an adjudication. But if they weren't adjudicated as a delinquent, then they probably have a subsection 1. So the difference between a conviction and a non-conviction can sometimes be difficult, but for someone who got probation, that's definitely a conviction. For someone who got detention time, that's definitely a conviction. If someone got supervision and didn't complete it in a satisfactory way, that is also a conviction. So that's the one case where their sentence can either be a conviction or a non-conviction depending on the outcome and how they treat their sentence. So I always tell people, if you've got a supervision and you're supposed to check in with the judge or you're supposed to do a certain amount of community service, make sure you do it, because that can really affect how long you have to wait before you can expunge. That can affect whether you have a conviction on your record or a non-conviction. So it's kind of in your hands at that point. And then the second type, like I said, is a little harder. So that only applies for people who have gotten a conviction. So like I said before, a conviction would include probation, doing detention time, getting supervision and not completing it in a way that's satisfactory. And this only applies to convictions for offenses that are a little more serious. So if it's a Class A misdemeanor or a felony, and I'll explain a little bit more about what those are in a minute, but if it's a Class A misdemeanor or a felony and it's a conviction, definitely falls under this subsection 2 category. And at that point, the person who's trying to expunge has to wait until they're 21 years old and then also wait 5 years after the case wraps up. So let me give an example. If someone's on probation for a felony and they got arrested when they were 17, they're on probation until they're 21. Now, because of that 5-year waiting period, they've got to wait until they're 26. So this can make a big difference for people who are trying to apply for colleges when they're 18, and those colleges are looking up their background and seeing this felony on there because they have to wait until they're 26. So like I said, this only applies for convictions, though, for more serious crimes. So even if a person was convicted of a crime, but it was a less serious crime, so that would be a Class B or C misdemeanor, it would still go back up to subsection 1 and be the easier type. So 18 plus no open cases. So I will say most of my clients who come into the help desk are subsection 1. It's pretty easy for them to expunge. And the last thing for me to say right here is that there are only 2 types of offenses under the Juvenile Court Act that are never eligible for expungement. So I just want to emphasize that the Juvenile Court Act is very nice to people who are trying to expunge for the most part. Unlike the adult side, where it can be very difficult to expunge or even seal a crime because adults are treated a little more harshly under the law. So expunge your record. If you are in an interview, and say you were adjudicated or convicted of a juvenile crime. So if the viewer is asking you a question like, have you been adjudicated or convicted of a crime, you can legally say no, even though that's technically not true because you've got it expunged, okay? So they can go back and they can look in those records and they won't see anything. And so your word is as good as true when you say that you haven't been adjudicated for a crime, if that makes sense. And then if an employer does happen to see somehow, which would be very difficult, but if they happen to go and see those expunged records, even though they're supposed to be gone, they cannot legally consider them. It would be illegal for them to even think about it. So that's pretty much it. That's the whole process of expungement and why it's important for juveniles to expunge. And for anyone who wants to visit the help desk, we're located at 1100 South Hamilton. It's in the Juvenile Detention Center, and we're on the ground floor, the first floor, right next to the clerk's office. So if you have trouble finding us, you can just go right into the clerk's office or ask someone where the clerk's office is, and we're right next door. It's hard to miss us. There's a blue sign, and we're open Monday and Tuesday from 9 till 4, and then Thursday from 9 till noon. So you don't even need to make an appointment. You can just walk right in. It's kind of like a walk-in clinic. And that's my phone number and email address. If you have any follow-up questions, you can always give me a call.